Okay, let's continue the next part of the product where we start providing the system with movies that the user can view and the user can reserve, right? So we have view movies and reserve a movie. And we have also view reservation, like someone made a reservation, so he should be able to view his own reservation. So how can we tackle this, right? Let's talk about first about this is basically the current phase of the product, right? That's what we have finished in the first part. Let's talk about first about how can we structure this. Okay, let's see how can we structure the actual data, the movie information and the reservation information. What does it actually have? Stuff like that, right? Okay, so let's just take this like that here. Let's okay. So let's say that we store the movies in a JSON file. Okay, let's call it movie.json. Let's say that this is gonna have a list of dictionaries, the same structure that we have used before for the accounts, and every movie is gonna have a unique ID. Let's say this is gonna start from IDs by 1, and a movie is going to have a description, right? And a movie is going to have actors, year of production, and finally, let's say that it's going to have a whole number where it will be um, played in, right? So I'm just gonna make an assumption here, just to make things a little bit simple, that each hole only plays a single movie, right? Like you can have this hole or this movie being played in multiple holes, so we can have a list like that of holes that plays that certain movie. Let's say that this movie is called Wonder, right? But I don't want to make this yani, more complex, so I'm just gonna stick with the assumption here that each hole only plays a single movie, and I'm going to label them by the number. Like if this is the movie ID number 1, so this first movie is played in the hole number 1, right? Just for consistency. Okay. And typically, if you think about it, you would see that you would have an account, right? Class conceptually like this, and you would have a movie. So reserve can actually fit to just be a method that this method can be either at the end of the association implemented there or can be implemented here, right? But what really will make this reserve an actual reservation class is the following, is that reservation has its own details, that method has its own details, right? And not only that, these details need to be recorded, it needs to be saved, stored in a file, right? So if you think about it, you're gonna have that the reservation is gonna have a time, right? The reservation is going to have a whole number, right? A reservation is going to have what else? Um, a reservation is going to have number of seats that's being reserved, right? Not to mention that it's going to have the username or the email from the account and the actual movie name from the movie, right? So the reserve method has so many things to be um, asked as inputs, has so many things to be stored as well, and that classifies the reserve to be its own actual class. So we would tackle this like this. We would say that we have an account and we have a reservation class, and I have converted that method into an association, this association name into an association class, and we have movie, right? And typically, the reservation is going to have info from the account, right? So the reservation should know about the it should know about the account class. So it should have the account object to access it and to get the username. Remember that this is something that we want to store, and it should have access as well to the movie object. So from a movie object, it should be able to extract the most important information, which is the movie name or the movie ID. Depends on what we are going to do just in a minute, right? And it's going to have all of these attributes, right? Whole number, number of seats. But we are not talking about the class here. We're just talking about how the data would be structured in a JSON file. Now, let's talk about the reservation JSON. You know that, or let's talk about the whole itself. You know that the whole itself is going to contain seats. The whole itself is going to contain a whole number, right? So this as well needs to be tracked in a wholes.json in a file, right? So let's call that this is a list of dictionaries as well, and I'm going to use the whole ID or whole number to be the actual unique key that I will use to access specific holes, right? And this kind of redundancy, I am making this on purpose just to emphasize on the point that we have seen in the databases, right? So you can tell that whole number in holes is something like a primary key in the holes table if we're talking databases, relational databases, right? And the whole number would be a foreign key in the table of movies if we're talking databases as well, right? So this is what we call foreign key and primary keys, and this is the main attribute that I'm going to use in order to join these tables together. Like if you have the movie and if you know from movie that this is the hole that the movie is going to be played in, via this whole number I can access the holes and get the list of details, which is going to be the seats available, the seats reserved, and stuff like that, right? So we're not gonna do any joins, by the way. It's just the concept that you're gonna see in the next semester in the database course. And the same concept of primary key and foreign key, we have talked about this in the database session the previous week, I believe, or yes, it's the previous week in the software design module, right? So this kind of redundancy is being made on purpose, okay? So let's go back to the details of the holes.json. So we have whole number, right? Let's talk about that. This is the first hole, right? Notice that the first hole is going to be in the first index. This is index of 0. Remember that this is a list by the end of the day. So that dictionary is at index of 0. So at index of 0, you're gonna reach hole number 1, right? Don't forget that, okay? Or to align everything, you can just start by giving an ID for the movie by 0 here, and the whole number is going to be 0, and this is going to be 0. So you don't really have to care about this adding +1 or subtracting -1 if you have the whole number or if you have the index, right? But I'm just going to leave it like that, right? And we should have also the movie name being stored, the movie name that is being played in this hole, right? And let's say that Okay, and we can also name it movie held, meaning that what is the movie that is being held in this hole, right? And the most important thing is that the seats. Okay, we can do it in one of two ways. You can have this seat as an internal dictionary that has, let's say that I'm going to assume that in every hole there's a fixed number of seats that is equal to 16 seats in every hole, right? So you can have 1, 2, 3, up to 16, right? And this dictionary by default is going to have something like a dash, just to indicate that these are not reserved. And once some seat is reserved, we can convert this dash into something like an X or something, right? Or let's have it as numbers. It's gonna be easier. Let's have it as numbers. Let's say that if the movie is not reserved, so by default all of the seats will have the value of 0. Once the movie is reserved, let's say that I will reserve seat number 16 and 3. So now these are going to have the value of 1, meaning that these seats are reserved and cannot be chosen, right? You can approach this a little bit more differently. You can have, if you don't want to do this dictionary thing, you can have the seats as just an integer, like this. Let's say we have 16 seats. And once the seat or multiple seats has been chosen, let's say that we have picked 2 seats, which are, for example, 14 and 3, seat number 3 for some reason, right? So these are 2 seats. So we are going to subtract these 2 from that total number of seats, which is going to be 14 seats left. And we would have another variable, right, inside that holds JSON, that is basically a list that contains the actual seats that is being reserved. So if we reserved 14, this is going to be appended in that list. And if we have 3, then this is going to be appended. So we are going to check for the reserved seat before we approve any reservation or approve any seat choice from the user, right? But I'm just going to stick to that dictionary thing. Oops. All right, and this is for the first hole, and things are going to be similar for the next holes. Every hole is going to be having a hole number, a movie held, a seats dictionary, and stuff like that. All right, and this is for the holes, the JSON, right? So if we have reservation now, let's talk about reservation. When we do the actual reservation, what will this include? So reservation JSON is going to include, first of all, let's say that this is a list of dictionaries, and let's say that we have a reservation ID, and notice that this needs to be tracked, meaning that before, this is going to be a class variable in the reservation class, as we will see in a minute, right? So this needs to be tracked. So you need to read this from the file to know what are the number of reservations that are being made in the whole system as a whole before you increment or you set that value or hard code that value into some specific value. Meaning that every time the system will start, you don't set this to 0, right? Instead, you read the actual value of the reservation ID that is being stored inside reservation JSON to know whenever you create another reservation, what will be the reservation ID for the next reservation made, all right? So we have a reservation ID, we have a username, we have a movie name, right? So this is what we are going to take from the movie object and from the account object. And we have also the time of the movie that is being reserved, right? And I think we're going to speak about the time in the we're going to speak about the time in the holes JSON. But I think we should have included a variable for the time. Let's say after the seats we have something like times, all right? And we will assume as well, this is assumption 1 and this is assumption 2, that times are fixed. for simplicity, right? So every hole plays only one movie, and this movie is played on 3 separate occasions. So every movie is being played, for example, at 5 p.m., at 8 p.m., and at, for example, 11 p.m., right? So this is the list of the times. So the user will pick a time, one of these times, right? And it's going to be stored in that reservation, and we will have the number of seats as well. Okay, and I think that's all about the reservation. And the whole number, yeah, the whole number, this one, this attribute right there. Okay, so this is that dictionary, and every reservation for every customer is going to have all of these values. All right. So let's see how can we approach or tackle this. Okay. Let's think about a naive approach, right? Or I'm not gonna say it's naive. Let's just think about an initial approach to this, right? Let's say that the first thing that is going to be changed is if I say that this is the main script. Remember that our main script, or the what we call the bootstrap file, right? This contains the display function, right? And once the display function runs, if you are logged in, then what will be triggered is that this boundary, this logged in account boundary, if you are logged in, right? And once you are logged in, so far we only have logout, right? That's the only thing that you can do if you are logged in. Now we want to add some functionality, which is basically view movies, right? And we want to have view reservations, and we want to have reserve a movie, right? So typically all of these additions should take place inside the login account UI boundary, right? This new account UI boundary was just there in the case of this is a new user, it's a non-existent user, right? But now we should include all of these things here inside the logged in account UI boundary, right? So if I logged in, I can choose any of these options, right? So let's say, remember that handle inputs was the method that we used that internally it calls the login inputs if the user wants to log in, for example, right? And the same thing for reservation, it's gonna be the same thing for reservation. Let's say that we have something called reserve inputs or make reservation inputs. And make reservation inputs is going to take inputs for a couple of stuff. This is going to be included as well in handle inputs. So this is going to be included as well in handle inputs. So we are going to ask about a couple of stuff. We're going to ask the user to choose a movie name. And hence the movie name is displayed in one whole number. So if we know the movie name, immediately and implicitly we're going to know the whole number. Right? So this is the first step, to ask the user to pick, right? To ask the user to pick movie name and whole number, right? And once we have the movie name and the whole number, if we have valid movie names, if we have movies that we have actually defined in movie.json, right? Then we would go and ask about the next step, which is basically asking about the actual time that you want to have this reservation, right? And then we would have to ask about the number of seats, right? Okay, so this is number 2. Let's say that the user is going to be asked to choose a time, and then the user will be asked to pick seats, right? We can make a function for every kind of input that you are seeing. You're gonna see this in a minute when I code this, right? So we can have a function for every one of those, every one of these 3 type of inputs, and we can include or call all of these input functions inside the reserve inputs, which is going to be called inside the handle inputs, just the way that the login inputs it has been called inside handle inputs. If you don't remember this, just watch the previous videos or watch the code of the handle inputs and you'll understand, right? All right, so what is next? Okay, so we can say, first of all, that if the movie name has been picked, right? Like these are not typically sequential, because if the movie has been picked, we will start to ask the user about the time. If the time has been picked, we will start to ask the user about the seats. If one of them was not did not have a valid input, let's say that the user has entered a number for a movie ID that does not exist, then I'm not going to ask about the time because the user did not enter a valid movie. The same thing goes for the time. If the user entered a time that is not valid, then I'm not going to ask about the seats, right? And so on. So these are not typically sequential. It's more like a conditional kind of input that we are asking, or a flow of inputs that we are asking the user to enter, right? But anyways, let's say that we will have inside the movie class, right? So let's have the movie class here. I know that this is a mistake. I should have had this a little bit bigger. Let me just rewrite this. Okay. So this is the movie class, and we have, as we said, we're gonna of course import all of the movies. This is the class variable of type stored files. This is gonna include all of the movies inside the movies.json. Okay, and we will have a movie ID, we will have a movie name, the things that we have said that's going to be inside the structure of the movies.json, a description, a actors, year, whole number, and stuff like that, right? Let's talk about the methods. Okay, so we can have the methods as following. Let's say if the user has entered as an input the movie name and the whole number, then they were valid, then we can do the following. We can say dot set movie info. Oh my god, the screen breaks again. So set movie information, right? So we can say that set movie information is a method inside movies, and what does it do is that it takes all of these values, right? The values, which is the movie name and the whole number, it takes the essential ones. So it takes the movie name and it takes the whole number, right? And figures out from the movies.json that we have stored inside movies class variable, it figures out via the movie name and the whole number, it figures out the rest of the variables and it set them, right? So it sets based on these inputs that we have taken from the user, which is the movie name and the whole number, which is deducted or deduced internally or automatically. We will set the values for the rest of the variables, right? So that's one. Okay, now if the movie is set, we are going to ask about the pick time. So we can use what we call the check movie is set. So if movie is set, then we are going to ask about the user. We will trigger the function that takes the time as an input from the user, right? So we have also we would have also check movie is set. right? Okay, and this is so far the movies, right? And we can have multiple stuff as well. So let's say when when the user logs out, we would have, this is the continuation of the methods. When the user logs out, we would reset all of the movie information, meaning that I'm gonna set all of these into none, right? And we would have a couple of stuff. Let's say that we will have some display methods. So this is gonna display all of the details, all of these details, right? So display or view movie details. And this is gonna have view just movie names, just the name of the movie, right? So this is the movie class, all right? Okay, so this is the movie class that we have advised in a minute earlier, right? And if you think about it, you saw that I've made a point here. Whenever we take the movie information, the movie name and the movie whole number, right? We want, after we pick these inputs, we want to set that movie information if the movie name was valid. Now, what kind of object do I need to access in order to get to the set movie information? Well, the answer is obvious. Set movie information is inside the movie object or the movie class. So I need to have a movie object in my login or login account UI. So I need to have a movie object like this of type movie. Okay, but notice something, and I would write something like that: movie object dot, as you're seeing here, oh my goodness, dot, as you're seeing here, set movie information. And set movie information is going to take the movie name and is going to take the whole number like that. Okay, but there's an issue here. In the ECB pattern, you have a boundary and you have a controller and you have an entity. In this case, this is the entity where the whole data is being held, or the whole information about the movie is being held, right? So this is the entity. Typically in an ECB pattern, you don't interact directly between the boundary and the entity. This is how that things go. You interact with the controller, then you interact with the entity. So just the way we have made a login controller, right? A login controller inside the login UI, which the login controller included the account from the account entity. So what we did there is that we sent an object of the account. If you've seen the previous videos, you'll understand what I'm saying. We've sent an account object into the login controller, which is this guy right there, right? And then we sent a login controller. Then we sent a login controller, login object controller, which included internally inside of it the account object, right, to the UI, to the boundary, right, to emphasize on the flow between boundary, controller, and the entity, right? The same thing goes here for movie. So one would say, all right, so we don't have a movie object. We, as a boundary, we don't really interact with the entity. That's straightforward, right? So we have a movie controller, and this is where things actually gets to be a little bit ugly. So this is the movie controller, and the movie controller is going to have a movie object passed into it. So this is a movie object of type movie, right? And I should have an interface for the method that I want to use, which is in this case set movie information. And this is part of the redundancy that we've talked about, but we actually need it, right? Previously in the, if you remember the logout, in the logout controller, you need that interface, you need that gateway, right? So this method inside the controller is going to call the logout method in the account, which is this method, right? So it's as if I'm saying, if you remember the code in the login controller, so this is the login controller class, it has the logout method, and all of that logout method was doing is that it is accessing the account object, and from that account object we were accessing the actual logout method. So there's some kind of redundancy here, but this is the kind of how the controllers actually work, whether we're talking about an ECB or we're talking about an MVC, right? So both of them are typically the same idea. Like you need to have a method in the controller which actually is implemented there in the actual entity object. So we're just like calling a method from another method. That's it, right? So after sending the movie object into the movie controller, I'm just gonna have a method here that says set movie information, and that method is going to trigger the set movie information that is inside the movie object, right? So now I'm going to send to the logged in account the movie controller object, which of type movie controller, right? So this is the kind of relation that we have here. So we are sending to this guy the movie controller object, all right, like that. And now, since we have the controller, typically what is going to happen, the chain is going to have this flow from the controller, access the movie object, which is in this case this guy, and this after that then access that method, which is set movie information, and send the movie name and send the whole number and send the movie information, right? So this is the first thing that is going to happen after we have the movie name and the movie and the whole number, right? And after that, if the movie is set, right, we're going to check if the movie is set. So typically that check movie is set is going to be as well there in the controller, and this is going to call the same method like that. So check movie is set, right? So if the movie is set and the values that we have taken from the user are valid, now let's do the next one, which is pick the time, right? So if we pick the time and if we pick the seats and both of them were valid, the next thing we do is that, first of all, from the controller, we say that I want to check, right, if movie is set or not. So if the movie information was set, meaning that the user has entered some input, which is basically the movie name, right, and the whole number, right, and from these we've used the movie set information. We use these values to figure out the rest of the values in the movie's class variable, which contains the movie.json, and we fetched the rest of the values, right? We fetched the rest of the values and we set them to the actual corresponding values, right? So if the movie is set, the thing that we can do afterwards is we can actually so if the movie is set, after that we can do the following, right? We can set the reservation information, right? So these are the reservation information. Let me just highlight them like this: the time and the seats. These are the reservation information, okay? So now I can set the reservation info, and this is gonna be a method, set reservation info, right? And set reservation info is going to have all of these values, which is basically the time that we've taken as an input, the seats, and as well we have a whole number. Like if you remember the structure of the holes.json, you'd remember that there was a whole number as well. So we will send a whole number like that, right? So where is that method? Where is that method is located? Well, if you remember our previous discussion, we said that we would have a class for the association name. So we're gonna have a, just remove all of this. I'm gonna have a reservation class. Okay. Oh, there's no need to write class here. So reservation, and the reservation is going to have of course, a reservations, which is the content inside a class variable, the content inside the holds.json, which is at the beginning is going to be an empty list. We don't have any reservation, but we are going to write into it the kind of reservation that the user will make. So it's going to be of type stored files, right? And it's going to have holds.json, right? And then we're gonna have a reservation count, and that's as well a class variable. So that reservation count is gonna check the current reservation ID inside the movies.json. So, oh my goodness, it's gonna check the reservation ID, and it's gonna take that number and store it inside of it, right? And it's gonna check the reservation ID from the reservation class variable, and we're gonna have a holds, right? I'm sorry guys. The reservations is a class variable that contains the actual reservations.json. So we have a file that is called the reservations.json, and for the time being this is going to be an empty list. Okay, but inside that empty list, that just as we discussed earlier, it's going to have dictionaries, and in every dictionary there is going to be a reservation ID. So there is count is going to be a class variable which is going to look for the latest reservation ID in the latest record. So I'm going to check the last element, which is at index of -1, the last element, and from that last element I'm going to find the reservation ID and set the reservation count to it, right? So I'm going to look as well in the reservations to get the reservation count, right? So I'm going to have the data inside reservations.json, which is this guy, right? And I'm going to have a holds class variable as well that is going to be having the data inside the holds.json, like that. So holds.json is going to be a dictionary that we have discussed earlier. Holds.json is going to have whole number, movie held, seats, right? And reservation is going to have reservation ID, which is going to be kept track, right? From that res count, right? So res count is going to look for the latest res ID that is at the last element, which is the last reservation made. And we're gonna keep track of the username, name, time, number of seats, whole number, stuff like that. But for the time being, the reservation.json is gonna be an empty class. It doesn't have any reservation for the time being. All right. Okay. So we will want to store the things that we would want to set, right? So we would want to have the time from the user and the seats, right? So we would have seats as well as a variable. Right? And time and res ID. I don't think I'm gonna have enough area here. All right. What else? Whole number. Right. These are the things that we are sending for set reservation info. So whole number. And remember, all of these things are inside the holds.json. I'm not doing anything different. Inside the holds.json, we had whole number, movie, held, seats, times, right? So I'm just gonna drag this down because I need extra space. Okay, so this is the movie controller. It has a movie object, as we said, and it has the set movie information, and it has the check movie is set, right? And it has as well the reset, and it has any method that you want to invoke from the object. You don't invoke it directly, you have a method that is corresponding to it in the controller, right? So that's the kind of relation that we have here. Okay, so this is the reservation. All right, what do we have else? Okay, and here there was a whole number, seats and whole number, right? Right? So the question is, where do we find set reservation info? Obviously in the reservation class, right? So let's say that this is the method, and let's call this set reservation info, and set reservation info is going to take the time that we take from the user as an input, the whole number, and the number of seats, or the actual seats list, and the whole number, right? And it sets the reservation for these guys. So it takes these values and it sets the values for the time, for the whole number, for the seats. But what about the reservation ID, right? So the reservation ID needs to have its own method, and you're gonna see why when we code this, because set reservation ID, its only purpose is that it increments the current reservation count. You can have this implicitly in the reservation info, but I'm just going to have a method that does that, and I'm going to include it, or going to have it called inside the set reservation info. Once we take the essential 3 values, then we are going to think about the reservation ID. All right, and as the same thing goes, maybe the user will log out, so we will have a reset reservation info, right? So you know the drill. Okay. Now the question is, how can we get to set reservation info? If you look at the boundary, you're gonna see that the boundary have a movie controller object, and we have a login controller object, which contains the account object, right? So from this guy, we should know the movie name if we needed them, because if you're gonna make a reservation, then you absolutely need to know the movie, and you absolutely need to know the username. And you can find the username inside the account, which is inside the login controller. You can find the movie name, which is inside the movie controller as well, which is inside the movie object inside of it. All right? But what about the reservation? We don't have a reservation object, so what do we do? Now, let's think about the logical relationship between a reservation and between an account, right? So we can say that this is fairly composition, meaning that if there is no account, there is no reservation, right? So if there is no account, there is no reservation, right? So this means that account is the whole and the reservation is the part, and that means that the reservation is going to be included as an object inside the account. And by object, I mean that the object is going to be created. That's composition. If you don't remember composition, watch the video that I've dropped about the composition earlier, or watch the guidelines. You're gonna see that I clearly illustrate this inside the guidelines video, right? So we're gonna have a reservation object, which is basically going to have reservation object created inside of it, right? So we're gonna have a reservation. That's typically that's not UML notation, that's not the class diagram notation, but I'm just saying that we are gonna create a reservation. I'm going to redo all of this class diagram in Lucidchart in a minute, but we need just to figure out how can we organize this. So we're gonna have a reservation object created inside that account object that is being created, which is going to be stored inside reservation object. And let's, for sanity check, just have a value for every account that is going to be called as has reservation. And this is just gonna be true or false, right? So by default, let's say that it's going to be false, meaning that the user by default doesn't have any reservations, right? And we would want to reflect this value as well inside the data.json, because our data.json inside the data.json. Our data.json so far had username, password, email, logged in, and now we're going to add a new key, a new column, which is going to be has reservation. Okay. All right, so we're gonna update the data.json as well. And now let's see now how can we access the set reservation. Now remember, the login controller contains the account. And the account, not only the account has the values for its own, but it has an object of the reservation. So the account has the reservation object, which include all of these stuff, all of these goodies, the variables, the methods. So from that object, which is inside the account, which is inside the controller, which is inside the login account UI, we can access the reservation object. So we can say from the controller object, right? From the controller object, the login controller object, right? Access the account object. And from the account object, access the reservation object. And from the reservation object, access the method which is set reservation, which is this method here. All right. So after we set the reservation, the last thing to do, if we have the movie information set, if we chose the movie, if we have the time and seats and whole number, so we have set the reservation info. Now this is the last step where we actually add or make reservation. So this is going to be a method as well, but where should it be placed? So add reservation. If you think about it, add reservation should be inside reservation class, right? That I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but if you remember, we didn't have, when we refactored into ECB, I took away every method that had stuff to do from the user, that had actually inputs to do from the user, which is in this case, previously before the ECB, we had create account, inside the entity class. And we said to ourselves that create account takes stuff from the input, from the boundary. Then hence, this should be in its own controller class, right? And the login is the same thing. We had previously, before the ECB, we had the login inside the account class. And we noticed that this takes input from the boundary, right? So why not just make a controller for it? And we did that when we refactored into ECB. Now the same thing is going to happen for add reservation, but before we think into ECB, let's just add the reservation method here inside the reservation class. And let's say that if the reservation info is set, well, this means that I know a couple of things, right? This means that I know the seats, I know the time internally, I know the reservation ID, I know the whole number, and that's really enough for me. So all I need to know is the username and the movie name, right? If you remember that diagram that we've made, so we have account and we have reservation as a class and we have the movie, right? So we set all of the time, the seats, the whole number, we set all of these internally inside the reservation class. All we need now from both of these guys is the username from the account and the movie name from the movie. So these are the two things that I'm going to have, right? Now the question is, where do we get these, right? So let's say that we are going to call the method that is going to be reservation, un, and mname, add reservation. And add reservation is going to be where, right? It's going to be inside the reservation class, right? Right? So this is going to be called from, remember that all of these guys are being called inside the boundary, inside the logged in account boundary, right? So from the logged in, it's the same thing as we did here for the set reservation info. I'm going to have the same stuff. So from the logged in, I think we have enough space here. So from the login controller object, access the account controller object, then access the reservation controller object, then access the add reservation and pass the username and the movie name. So where do we get the username? Remember, we are inside the boundary class, and inside the boundary class, right? Inside the boundary class, seemingly I have a object of the controller, login controller, which has an object of the account, and I can, from that account, I can get the username. So I can find the account from the username. I'm sorry, we can find the username from the account which is inside the login controller from this part. So we can get the username like that: login controller account dot username. Boom, we have the username. What about the movie name? Right? If we have the movie controller object, right, which has the movie object, right, we can get the movie name, right? So we can say from the login, from the movie controller object, access the movie object, then access the movie name, and boom, we have the movie name, right? All right. So far, we seem to know what we are doing, but if we want to actually refactor into ECB, this method, and this is the problem with the current design, this method actually takes stuff, as well as set reservation, right? Set reservation takes stuff from the boundary, and add reservation takes stuff from the boundary. Then wouldn't it be actually logical to have something like a reservation controller class that actually contains all of these methods and has an object from the reservation object, right? Just the same thing that we have done for the movie. We have a movie controller class, right? I mean, logically, yes, that's the solution, but this will be way overcomplicated, right? So instead, let's do the following. Let's say that we have the reservation class, right? Let's say I'm just gonna remove all. That's the kind of the final diagram that we are going to work with, right? So let's say that the reservation class is not going to have it's not going to have the add reservation in it, right? And let's say that we don't really need the following. Let's say that I'm gonna delete all of this. Things is going to be a little bit different. Let's say that we don't need the movie controller, because if you think about it, the movie controller only, it's so redundant. It doesn't do anything new. It just calls the set movie information from here, and it calls the check movie is set from there. There's nothing special about this. So we can remove the movie controller object, and I'm going to tell you what is going to be the replacement for this. Okay, and let's say that I'm gonna delete all of them. Okay, and instead, let us say that the login controller is not going to only have the login functionality in it. Let's say that this controller is going to be a little bit broad, right? It's the same idea. We said that in the logged in account controller, we should be able to, from the logged in account boundary controller, if we are logged in, we should be able to view movies, view reservation, and make reservation, right? And so we added the reserve movie inputs or reserved inputs like that, and we said that reserved inputs is going to call a function that picks the movie name from the user, and it picks the actual whole number, and it picks the time afterwards if these will prove to be correct. So this is the first thing, and these are the second, the time, then the number of seats. And if everything goes well, we're going to call add reservation to get or to add the reservation via the username and via the movie name, right? But instead of having a movie controller, we now don't have a movie controller here, right? So instead of doing that, just the way that we have relied on the boundary to take our inputs that are related to view movie, view reservation, and reserve movie, we are going to rely on the login controller to control these inputs that we have taken for these functionalities and pass it to the desired functions, whether it's in the movie class or whether it's in the reservation class, right? So I'm just going to rename that login controller. So let's call it something like logged in account controller. And that logged in account controller can do multiple things. It can log in, it can let's say it will have all of the functionalities that we have inside the movie controller that we have removed, which is basically the stuff that we have here but redundant. So we can actually set movie information. Notice that set movie information is basically here, right? And it takes a movie name and it takes a whole number, which are these two. And as well, it has reset movie information. Reset movie info, right? And it can actually interact with the reservation class, right? It can actually interact with the reservation class, so it can set the reservation info, right? Set reservation, not movie info. One would say, where does it get these? Where can it access this method? Remember that the account has a reservation object right now, right? From this composition here. Okay, so set reservation info takes a couple of things. It takes the time, it takes the seats, it takes the whole number. Where do we get these from? We get this from the boundary. So this means that the boundary, which have already a relationship existing here, right? So now that boundary is going to access the login controller object, which has the account object inside of it, which has the reservation object inside of it. So it can easily call the set reservation info. But where can we call the set movie information? Notice that we don't have anything inside this controller that interacts with the actual movie class, right? So we can add another movie object, right? So actually, when we create an object from the logged in account controller is going to have an object from the account, which includes an object internally from the reservation object, and it's going to have an object from movie, right? So there's another arrow like that. There's another arrow like this that goes to the movie, all right, like that. So we have a movie object being sent into that logged in account controller, and hence we should be able to access the methods inside the movie object, which is the set movie information, the reset movie information, the check movie is set, and so on. Okay, all right. And we have as well here reset reservation info when the user logs out to give room for a new user, right? And what else do we have? I think that's it. The main event, which is the main one that we have actually taken away from the entity, because we said that entity does not actually you do not interact with the boundary directly, right? And when we have a method that actually takes some data from the boundary and creates an entry inside the entity, like the one that we have seen here for create account, this should be in its own controller, right? The same thing for create reservation or add reservation. So I'm going to have add reservation, right, inside the logged in account controller, the newly named controller here. So this is gonna take only the movie name and the username. What about the rest of the variables? Well, the rest of the variables are set already inside the reservation object, inside the account object, right? So I can access them as I like. They are internally set, right? But the add reservation, it needs the username and it needs the movie name, because it does not, the reservation here doesn't have these attributes. There is no username and there is no movie name. So that's why I'm taking these as arguments, right? So where do we get this from? Where? Well, we get the username from the actual account object, right? And we get the movie name from the actual movie object, right? And that's it. And if you want to view some movies, you're gonna need to access view movie details from the movie object. So we need to have an interface for it in the controller to call it, right? So we would have to copy or to create a method that calls movie details like that. And if you want to display movie names, like this. All right. All right. And maybe I didn't talk about the rest of the stuff. Maybe we would have a couple of things on the actual reservation class. Like, let's say that the reservation class is going to have something like view seats, right? And check seat available. Before we do the reservation. And let's say that it has something like reserve seat, right? We should be able to reserve the seat, right? So if the user entered the movie name and time, right? So we set the movie information. That's one, right? If we have the time, then we set the time. Or if we have the time and seats, then we will set the reservation info, right? And maybe before setting the reservation info, if we have the time, right, we're just gonna have it for now. And if we have the seats, if the seats are available, then we can reserve the seats. Once we have the time and the reserved seats, we can set the reservation info. So this is 4, right? After that, 5 is going to be adding the actual reservation when everything is ready. All right, so this is the sequence here. So this is reserved seats. Okay. And let's say that reserved seats is going to take the whole number that we enter as an input and the seats list. Or seats, just seats like that. Okay. All right. So let's try to formulate this on Lucidchart to make things a little bit clearer.